Hello everyone, it's Jeff Rich here from the Burning Archive, and welcome to my show where I talk about history, the world powers and the world cultures and how they're reshaping our world today. And I've been meaning to make a video about the historian Niall Ferguson, one of the more public intellectuals, historians in the world today. Has a bit of a reputation for advocating the interests of, actively saying the British Empire was a good thing and the American Empire would be a better thing if Americans just took responsibility for it a little bit more and, assumed, in Rudyard Kipling's words, which I believe Niall Ferguson actually quoted, the white man's burden. And he has written many books, Empire, Colossus. This book here, I've got a very old copy of it, Cash Nexus. I think it might also be known as The Ascent of Money. And more recently, Doom, as well as a biography of Henry Kissinger, his mentor to some degree. The person he has spent 20 years of his life writing a biography. He published the first volume up to the point at which Henry Kissinger actually entered the Nixon administration. He took 10 years to write that. He's taken another 10 years, reportedly, to be writing the next volume of the biography. It may well be a little bit like those George R. Martin versions of or novels of the Games of Thrones series that, we may never quite see published. In any case, he is a very prominent historian. I was going to do a bit of a review of his works, but he found himself this week in a major public controversy with a controversial figure, JD Vance, and the Vice President of the United States, right off the heel of, refusing to regulate II and insulting Europe and all sorts of diplomatic faux pas, which went down well in the American electoral base, perhaps, but were not so well received in the rest of the world, the 96% of the world that's not America. So he, JD Vance that is, had a major public spat with Niall Ferguson. And I'm going to do a bit of a reaction video in this video, talking you through the sparring between these two mighty intellects, just offering a few comments on it about what it tells us about the self-understanding of American elites. And I'd count Niall Ferguson, Sir Niall Ferguson, kind of a British American, but really he's based at the Hoover Institute. He's very integrated into the American Imperial War faction. Offer a few reflections on what this exchange tells us about their current mindset and how they really use history, whether they are really learning anything from history or whether history is the loser. This contretemps started with a tweet from Niall Ferguson. You can read this first tweet here, but I'll read it out for you. It was on the 20th of February 2025, and Niall Ferguson was a bit upset with the way in which the Trump administration is backing off Ukraine, saying that Ukraine is losing the war and it's time to negotiate peace. Especially following the meeting in Riyadh between Russian and American US foreign ministers. So Niall Ferguson quoted George H.W. Bush, one of those from 1990, saying, "This will not stand, this will not stand, this aggression against Kuwait, the very first Iraq war," in which George H.W. Bush, of course, enlisted the support of none other than Mikhail Gorbachev to pursue his war aims. What Niall Ferguson has to say here is he gives the full quote from John Mearsham's biography, and he says future students will be asked why this stopped being the reaction of a Republican president to the invasion of a sovereign state by a dictator, implying why on earth. History is going to ask why Donald Trump appeased Vladimir Putin in these negotiations over the Ukraine war. So following that piece of, well, a little bit of bombast really, yet again evoking Munich, evoking an entirely different situation with the 1990. And then JD Vance responds to that with this quite significant and long tweet, which I will bring up for you now. JD Vance's Twitter handle says, Christian husband, dad, Vice President of the United States. How wholesome that is. So here we can see the tweet, and I'll just read through it and just introduce a few comments. Now, first of all, he says, this is moralistic garbage, which is unfortunately the rhetorical currency of the globalists, because they have nothing to say. Well, that's a courteous introduction, JD, I guess consistent with the nature of your talk at the Munich Security Dialogue. Curiously enough, a couple of days before, JD Vance, who seems to be wanting to make a bit of a habit of this, engaged in a bit of a Twitter dialogue with the European journalist Thomas Fazzi at Battle for Europe on Twitter. And Thomas Fazzi wrote how impressed he was by the fact that, here for the first time we see a Vice President of the United States engaging in free and open public debate on matters. I'm not entirely sure responding to a comment, even though it probably is right to say Niall Ferguson's comment was moralistic garbage. But basically starting out with a pretty fierce insult is not entirely what I would call free, open and civil debate. However, he continues that I'll just summarise this, that for 3 years he and President Trump have been making two arguments. One, that the war wouldn't have started if President Trump was in office, and two, that neither Europe nor Biden administration nor Ukrainians had any pathway to victory. Now, of course, it's probably not really true that the war would have started if President Trump was in office. After all, the war did start in 2014 at least, and continued, indeed in some ways escalated, including undermining the Minsk agreements, which secured some level of peace during Donald Trump's presidency. So for all the will and, for all the crankiness from JD Vance, I don't know if he's really got his history straight on this point. And then his other point is that there is no pathway to victory, which is probably truer, but he doesn't quite face the more brutal fact that it's the United States has been on a pathway to defeat. In any case, he comments then that for 3 years the concerns of people who were obviously right were ignored. And here he now gets into Niall Ferguson, and I'll just highlight this piece for you. What is Niall's actual plan for Ukraine? Another aid package? Is he aware of the reality on the ground of the numerical advantage of the Russians, of the depleted stock of the Europeans, or their even more depleted industrial base? All good points. And then he says that instead he quotes a book about George H.W. Bush from a different historical period and a different conflict. That's another currency of these people, reliance on irrelevant history. I think if he were making a more objective commentary, he might say it's a very common thing for people to draw moving but inappropriate historical comparisons, or making historical comparisons without noting the differences. In any case, JD Vance continues that President Trump is dealing with reality, which means dealing with the facts. And here are some of the facts. So number one, while our Western European allies' security has benefited greatly from the generosity of the United States, they pursue domestic policies that offend the sensibilities of most Americans and defence policies that assume continued over-reliance. So let me jump in here and say that, that's not really a fact, JD, isn't it? That's a whole lot of opinions about, has Western European ally security really benefited greatly from the generosity of the United States, or has the United States exposed or reduced the security of Europe by endlessly expanding NATO eastward? And is it really the case that the European countries pursue domestic policies that offend the sensibilities of most Americans? And what does that matter when one comes to, international affairs? It's certainly not a fact. It's a pretty tendentious opinion. And then, of course, the common refrain that is so persistent in American talk of foreign policy at the moment, that Europe has defence policies that assume continued over-reliance. Let's not get into the arguments about that. I'm going to make a separate video on that point. But again, this is opinion, not fact, and it's certainly not historical fact. It's a pretty a mistaken version of the history of NATO. Number two, Russians have a massive numerical advantage in manpower and weapons in Ukraine, and that advantage will persist regardless of further Western aid packages. Again, the aid is currently flowing. Here we can say that JD Vance is talking facts, and there have been many programs by so many people on YouTube about this. I won't belabor the point. The third point JD Vance makes is that the United States retains substantial leverage over both parties to the conflict. Now, this comment makes me think of the memorable moment during the Munich Security Conference, I think, when Keith Kellogg was asked, the octogenarian general who's a special envoy on Russia or the Ukraine conflict, Keith Kellogg was asked, so who are the two protagonists and who is the intermediary? And he couldn't really give a particularly compelling answer because, of course, the United States is a party to the conflict. Most of the EU nations are parties to the conflict. They've sent soldiers, they've sent foreign fighters, they've sent weapons, they've sent a hell of a lot of money. I suppose you could say that there is some level of truth in this, that there is leverage that the United States has over the parties. But again, it's very much an opinion, a judgment. It's not really a fact, and it also really misrepresents the multi-dimensional nature of this conflict and the United States' direct participation in it, as has been repeatedly pointed out, including the various attacks into the the central areas of Russia. Number 4, ending the conflict requires talking to the people involved in starting it and maintaining it. And indeed, I guess that conversation can begin within the White House, really, can't it? But this, again, is a reasonable point and a good rejoinder to the "you can't talk to Putin" sort of chorus that comes out of people like Niall Ferguson. And then finally, he notes that the conflict has placed stress on tools of American statecraft, from military stockpiles to sanctions, and we believe that continued conflict is bad for Russia, bad for Ukraine, and bad for Europe. But most importantly, it is bad for the United States. I guess that is probably as close as we're going to get to an admission of strategic defeat by the United States in this conflict. Then JD Vance continues, "Given the above facts, we must pursue peace, and we must pursue it now. President Trump ran on this, he won on this, and he is right about this. It is lazy, historical nonsense to attack as appeasement every acknowledgement that America's interest must account for the realities of the conflict." Well, that's true. It is lazy historical nonsense. However, it's an incredibly common problem in the United States at the moment, and it's broader than just every acknowledgement that America's interest must account for the realities of the conflict. It appears to be appeasement if there's even some sort of dialogue or acknowledgement that there are other nations, other states, other parties out there in the world that might have interests that are distinct but require negotiation with America's interests. So, as he says, that interest, not moralisms or historical literacy, will guide President Trump's policy in the weeks to come. Now, no doubt, I don't think the moralisms really troubled Niall Ferguson. He likes to think of himself almost as a conservative idealist, a very moralistic imperialist. But the charge of historical illiteracy certainly got under his skin. And let's have a look at how he responded. So Niall Ferguson says, "Well, thank God also for free and open debate." Well, yes, free and open debate with a lot of insults, but I guess that's free and open debate. Then Niall says, "Having visited Ukraine every year but one since 2011, I think I have an informed and a realistic view." Well, maybe, or perhaps you have an extremely biased view, and I guess the whole world knows that Niall Ferguson has been seeking to influence and visit Ukraine since 2011, 3 years before the events at the Maidan in 2014, 3 years before Victoria Nuland's infamous comments and determination of the members of the government that formed after those events in the Maidan. And he has often visited. Indeed, I've listened to podcasts of his visiting and talking at the conferences of the Ukrainian oligarch Viktor Pinchuk's foundation regularly. So I think this is an interesting statement that, well, it looks like Niall is not really speaking as a scholarly historian. He's speaking as an advocate on behalf of selected American and Ukrainian interests. And then he says, "I repeatedly criticised the Biden administration for its failure to deter Putin in 2021 and failure to end the war while Ukraine still had some leverage." Well, yes, but it was nothing as fierce as the criticism, of course, that Niall Ferguson launched at Donald Trump in 2020 and his glee at his defeat and likely demise. It does seem that poor old Niall is trying to reconnect with the new powers that be in the United States. I have said more than once in the past 3 years that the war would not have happened if President Trump had been re-elected. He's fawning. It's a statement of loyalty. nothing more. And, I guess one could go back over Niall Ferguson's many, many, many comments on the Ukraine war over the last 3 years and maybe make assessments of just how reliable he has been as a judge of events, much, much less reliable than many of the people that people have come to rely on the alternative media over the last 3 years. I supported his campaign for re-election last year, consistently predicted his and your victory, and welcomed the vibe shift that victory represented. Please don't beat up on me, says Neil. I'll be a loyal advocate for you too. I've also supported the president's previous calls to negotiate peace between Russia and Ukraine. However, he's never supported the negotiation of peace and basic normal diplomatic relations between Russia and the United States of America. And that is what is happening now. So I am not sure I really qualify as a globalist. Well, I think fair enough to object to that casual insult from a JD Vance. In fact, I agree with all of the 5 points you make. Indeed, I praised your Munich speech, but I simply cannot understand the logic of beginning a negotiation this difficult by conceding so many crucial points to Russia. And then he goes into the negotiations, and I think I might just skip this part because it seems quite inaccurate to me, because he says, well, NATO membership has been taken off the table. Maybe that seems to be the implication of Pete Hegseth's comments, but he is just one person, and one of the dilemmas with the United States, of course, has been who really knows what is on and off the table. And then the loss of 20% of its territory has in effect been conceded. Well, I heard Pete Hegseth said the reality on the battleground is Ukraine is not going to recover its pre-2014 borders, which is not a loss of its territory, of 20% of its territory. It's just refusing its rather dubious claim to Crimea. And then I have read also that American officials are suggesting a different sort of peacekeeping force, including non-European countries. Heaven forbid, non-European countries looking after the interests of Europe and America, such as Brazil or China, that would sit along an eventual ceasefire line as a sort of buffer. China? Seriously? Seriously, Neil? Is that really your attitude to the world today? Truly quite an astonishing thing in his fawning behaviour. On Wednesday, President Trump accused Ukraine of having started it, meaning the war. He also cast doubt on the legitimacy of President Zelensky's government. Well, he probably just stated facts that President Zelensky's constitutional term expired about 9 months ago. He's, outlawed all media, opposition media, or alternative media, or opposition parties. There are some pretty serious questions about the legitimacy of President Zelensky's government. It is not moralistic garbage, but he says a hard and realistic. Oh, there's that word that people love to use to sort of rhetorically boost their point of view, to say their view is realistic and your view is a delusion. A hard and realistic lesson of history that wars are easy to start and hard to end. Well, yes, and maybe no, I don't know if the lessons of history are really quite that cliched. You can watch my video on Richard Overy's The Causes of War, and also an earlier video I did on Geoffrey Blaney's famous book from the early 1970s about what causes the outbreak of peace, in the video description below. As for historical literacy, here are some facts. And then he goes through the periods and dates it took Woodrow Wilson to negotiate an end to World War One and helped the Allies won. Well, yeah, I guess so. 2 years, 18 days to negotiate an end to the Korean War. Well, as I understood it, the Korean War remains a frozen conflict, and the war powers granted through the Korean War are still used by the US government to conduct wars all around the world. Have the Americans really negotiated an end to the Korean War? The borders, Korea has not been reunified. 3 years, 5 months, 24 days to negotiate an end to the Vietnam War, and 5 years, 5 months, 1 day to negotiate peace between Israel and Egypt. I think these are perhaps more tendentious historical, statistical trivia. I don't know if they are real facts, but then JD Vance didn't really produce a whole lot of facts in his discussion. This appears to be a debate about historical literacy where a lot of myths and misinformation and just bluster and bluff is being, passed between both parties. I earnestly hope that the Trump administration can negotiate an end to this war, but if we end up with a peace that dooms Ukraine first to partition, and again a historical analogy that is probably not appropriate, and then to some future invasion, merely speculative slur, it will be a sorry outcome. To repeat, I agreed with most of your criticisms of Europe at Munich. Of course he did. I'd add that the Europeans have talked for strategic autonomy for too long without making a serious attempt to achieve it. But you and President Trump campaigned last year with a slogan that dates back even further than George H.W. Bush's words that I quoted. That phrase was peace through strength. I wish you luck. And then JD Vance had another go and it seemed to back off things a little bit. He says, on the general background, yes, you have been more right than wrong on a lot of the details of the conflict, which is why I'm surprised to hear you call the administration's posture appeasement. Now, I think it's excellent that someone prominent in America is actually starting to call out all this nonsense, comparing every conflict in the world to Munich 1938 and appeasement. It doesn't even understand the actual nature of what appeasement was in 1938, let alone accurately describe the events of today. And then he really makes a valid comment that accusations of appeasement hinge on a few arguments. The first is the criticism that we're even talking to the Russians. His third point deals with the specifics of the negotiations, noting that a lot of people are just jumping at rumours in the press, and indeed Niall Ferguson, for his realistic historical point of view, his historical literacy, was doing that. Finally, he concludes many of the subjective criticisms amount to pearl clutching that don't ultimately matter. I'm happy to defend POTUS's criticisms of the Ukrainian leadership. You're welcome to disagree, but these critiques of POTUS don't bear on the war or on his negotiation to end it. So that is the nature of the exchange. And over at Niall Ferguson's Substack, he got off the somewhat strange terrain of Twitter and looked instead at and wrote on his Substack at the sort of Barry Weiss outfit, the Free Press so-called, where he wrote about JD Vance's fighting words against me and Ukraine. I can't read all of this because it's sort of behind a paywall, but let's just have a little look at the opening paragraphs. It's not every day I'm accused by the president, a vice president of the United States, no doubt on behalf of the president, of purveying moralistic garbage and historical literacy, and of being a globalist. I don't know, I think Neil's been called a globalist by quite a few people. But those were the charges levelled against me by JD Vance this morning. I suppose I should not have been surprised by the onslaught this week. President Trump's efforts to negotiate an end to the war in Ukraine took what struck me as a bad turn. Now, I'm not one of those who objects to Trump talking to the Russian president, nor am I against the new Secretary of State Marco Rubio meeting with his Russian counterpart. A war that cannot be ended on the battlefield must be ended by negotiation and peace talks, blah, blah, blah. However, in the past 10 days, the Trump administration, which had up until this point been striking the right tone, made a series of unforced errors, and so he goes on. I don't expect to find a lot of historical truth in what Niall Ferguson says. I think Niall Ferguson's approach to history is, in a way, very much the approach to history practiced by his mentor, Henry Kissinger, an approach to history that kind of served big ideas of imperial power and world order, but was, in Kissinger's case, actually based on a relatively brief period of real service. He was only a public official for, I think, 8 years between 69 and 77. But in Niall Ferguson's case, he hasn't even done that. He is just one of these people who's just a talking head at the Hoover Institute and the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, and chats with John Anderson and chats with Douglas Murray and chats with all sorts of people from the sort of conservative American audience. He's even said in recent months that he's had a late adult Christian conversion. Good on him. Spirituality is important for many people, but he does seem to be doing his best to fit in with the new governing elite of America. Niall Ferguson has certainly written some good books. I would actually probably describe his most representative book as being his biography on Kissinger. In many ways, what he describes Kissinger as, which is as a conservative idealist who was brave enough to fight the Cold War, is really Niall Ferguson's image of himself. But this kind of vision of history, unfortunately, I think, is creating conflict, creating disastrous foreign policy wherever it is happening. But you can always rely on Niall Ferguson to sort of be, spouting moralistic garbage from the sidelines without having any real plan. Perhaps, just as JD Vance said, a lot of things that JD Vance said, I think, were highly polemical and tendentious. But on that point, I think he probably nailed it. And the historian was the loser. Thanks for watching.